Well, thank you very much. We're using this technology for the first time. I just want to check that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
I can't hear you. Yes, you can. Okay,
Yes.
very good. Let me proceed. So thank you all very much. I really appreciated the remarks of both Saul and Nabil, and having heard them, I find it's quite remarkable that we are very closely aligned in our comments this morning, which shouldn't be surprised because we are taking a law-based approach to this, where we are not deferring to the politics of powerful states, but the norms and standards of international law, as imperfect as they are. And we all know that there is a common refrain among politicians and diplomats and UN officials that goes something like this: there is no alternative to a two-state solution. But this is both a blatant lie, and I have argued, an open declaration of lawlessness. It is a lie because there are many alternatives to a two-state solution. One could imagine a confederation, two states, three states, four states, or no states at all, instead incorporating all of historic Palestine into a kind of restored Greater Syria. And of course, there are also one-state solutions. In fact, several variations of one state. One can imagine a single Jewish state, a single Muslim state, or why not a single Christian state. But Palestinians are not all of one faith. There are Muslim Palestinians and Christian Palestinians and atheist and agnostic Palestinians, and there has also always been a minority of Palestinian Jews. And then there is the single Jewish state that is the goal of the Zionist project through the conquest and ethnic cleansing of all of historic Palestine and beyond. Finally, the status quo is already a kind of one-state reality because the Israeli regime rules all of Palestine from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. But of course, a Zionist regime is not a solution. It is, in fact, the problem that remains to be solved from an international law perspective. So when Western politicians and diplomats and UN officials say there is no alternative to the two-state solution, what they really mean is that there is no other alternative that does not preserve Zionism and the Zionist regime. And that is their principal objective. Not peace, not the restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people, but the preservation of a Zionist, settler colonial, racist, supremacist state in the heart of the Arab world. That was the centerpiece of Balfour, of partition, of Oslo, of the French-Saudi proposal now codified in the so-called New York Declaration, and of Donald Trump's 20-point colonial plan. And it has been the essence of the Israel exception to international law throughout. But beyond the demonstrable falsehood of the statement that there is no alternative to a two-state solution, it is also an open declaration of lawlessness. It is an abdication of UN norms and standards, and it is a reaffirmation of the Israel exception to international law. Simply put, the two-state solution is incompatible with the most fundamental requirements of international law, including the UN Charter and the provisions of international human rights law. The Israel exception was carved out by Western powers even before the establishment of Israel and even before the establishment of the United Nations itself. It has its roots in the Sykes-Picot conspiracy of 1916, the Balfour Declaration a year later, and the League of Nations mandate for Palestine 3 years after that. But it was officially baptized at the United Nations in 1947 and 1948 with the partitioning of Palestine against the will of the indigenous people and the ratification of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine with the recognition of the Israeli state. All of that not under, but despite the advent of the modern era of international law. This was the original sin of the United Nations. And at the same time that a new UN was working to decolonize countries across the globe, with the exception of Palestine, indeed, the commitment of the West to this exception was on clearest display in 1948. It was in that year that the UN adopted both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, declaring the universality of human rights and equality for all, and the Genocide Convention, prohibiting the intentional destruction of a people in whole or in part. But it was also the year that apartheid was born in South Africa, and the year of the Nakba, perpetrated in Palestine, both of these with Western complicity, and both effectively placing the racial hierarchies of settler colonialism above the imperatives of human rights and the responsibilities of decolonization. And indeed, the closest historical analog to Palestine is, of course, apartheid South Africa, a white supremacist, apartheid, settler colonial state in the heart of Africa, with an enforced legal and societal order in which the colonizers maintained a system of domination over the indigenous African people. And remember, the South African apartheid regime also offered a two-state solution, with most of the land going to the colonizers, but small parcels to be provided to the indigenous Africans as Bantustans. But the people of South Africa knew that no archipelago of Bantustans could ever restore the inalienable human rights of the South African people that had been taken from them by a racist settler colonial regime in the name of apartheid. Just as no Palestinian Bantustan on a small fragment of historical Palestine could ever restore the rights of the Palestinian people taken from them in the name of Zionism. Because it is not Palestinian self-determination that must be dismantled to resolve the 100-year crisis in Palestine. And it is not the framework of international law that must yield to Zionism. Rather, even a cursory consideration of international law reveals that it is the Zionist regime, its supremacist ideology, its settler colonial structures, and its apartheid system that are the root causes of the problem, and that must yield. It is these systems and structures that must be dismantled if the international law imperatives of human rights and peace are to be realized. And imperatives they are. In fact, the rights and obligations violated by the Zionist project, whether in its one-state or two-state incarnation, are the highest norms of international law. That is, so-called jus cogens and erga omnes rules of international law. This includes the prohibition of the acquisition of territory by force, which is nevertheless the principal means by which Zionist forces in 1947 and 1948, and Israeli forces since then, have acquired the territory on which they declare their state. It includes the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, as guaranteed by the UN Charter, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, among other international treaties. It also includes the prohibition of apartheid, classified as a crime against humanity in international law, and without which a Zionist regime could not be maintained. It includes the prohibition of genocide, to which Palestinians have repeatedly been subjected since 1947 in order to realize the Zionist project. And it includes the imperative of equality and non-discrimination as codified in the Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the two human rights covenants, and a host of other binding human rights instruments. This includes all civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. And this includes also the political rights of those who have a right to be a part of the polity of that land, but who are unlawfully exiled. Needless to say, these rights and obligations are entirely antithetical to political Zionism. And none of these fundamental rules of international law can be satisfied by a two-state solution that retains a Zionist regime in any part of historic Palestine. Indeed, even if the rights of Palestinians in the Bantustan of the second state could be realized, which is highly unlikely, but even if they could, such a dispensation would effectively abandon the rights of two other segments of the Palestinian people. That is, Palestinians inside the green line of the Zionist state of Israel, including their right to equality, and Palestinians in the diaspora, including their right to return to their homes and to compensation. Indeed, the right to remedies and redress for violations is another key principle of international human rights law, just as the right to return is a key precept of international refugee law. And the issue of legitimacy under international law leads to two inevitable conclusions. First, the absolute rejection of all forms of colonialism, the illegitimacy of a Zionist apartheid state, and the fundamental incompatibility of the continuation of a genocidal regime with the human rights law principle of accountability. And secondly, the legitimacy under international law of armed resistance to foreign occupation, colonial domination, and racist regimes, the legitimacy of which continues until liberation is complete, not partial. In the simplest terms, this means there can be no peace without justice, and no sustainable solution can hide from this fundamental truism. Finally, as affirmed by the International Court of Justice, no negotiation process can erase the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people as contained in international human rights and humanitarian law. The court has declared that such negotiations and agreements do not and cannot trump the rights of the Palestinians and the obligations of Israel under international human rights and humanitarian law. Indeed, under Article 47 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, quote, "The protected population shall not be deprived of the benefits of the convention by any agreement concluded between the authorities of the occupied territories and the occupied power." For this reason, the court has ruled that these kinds of agreements, like the Oslo Accords, cannot be understood to detract from Israel's obligations, the rights of the Palestinians applicable in Palestine. The result is clear. The rights of the Palestinian people are not subject to negotiation with their oppressor. They are not subject to the mediation of the US as a co-oppressor. They are not subject to the blessings of the Security Council, and they're not subject to endless talks on an amorphous promise of a two-state solution. Rather, these rights are inalienable. They need not yield to imposed solutions. Rather, these solutions must yield to Palestinian rights as codified in international law. Finally, while these principles of international law are beyond dispute, indeed, they are by now axiomatic, defenders of the Zionist project will seek to challenge them by invoking UN resolutions like UN General Assembly Resolution 181 on the partition of Palestine, or Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338 on Israeli withdrawal to pre-1967 borders. But what this argument misses is that, one, while the UN General Assembly could make recommendations, it had no power to partition a country. And two, the powers of both the General Assembly and the Security Council derive entirely from the UN Charter. It has no other powers at all. And the UN Charter, as a treaty, is a part of international law. It is not above international law. And as such, all institutions and powers of the United Nations are subject to international law, including and especially jus cogens and erga omnes norms, like self-determination, the non-acquisition of territory by force, and the prohibition of apartheid. As such, any decisions of international political bodies like the General Assembly and the Security Council that conflict with such binding rules of international law are both ultra vires and unlawful. In sum, the political bodies of the UN that have worked hard to legitimize the Zionist project and to preserve the Israel exception to international law, they have abandoned those rules of international law in favor of an illegitimate political process. Abandoning that project and that exception is not a radical proposal. Rather, it is a return to international law. There is only one conclusion. The only solution that could be consistent with international law, including international human rights law, is a single democratic state with full compensation and reparations and the right to return for all Palestinians, the dismantling of Zionism and apartheid, full accountability for perpetrators of apartheid, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and full equality and the same guaranteed human rights for all Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, and others from the river to the sea. Thank you.